Welcome back to our tutorial series. This is part 3, an introduction to blueprints. If you've been following along in our tutorial series, last time we talked about creating classes using Unreal Engine 4. And now we're going to go a little bit more in depth about how we can interface with those classes using the Unreal Engine. So the first thing I want to talk about is UProperties. And specifically, I want to talk about UProperties and their specifiers. And so I'm going to talk about 6 specifiers for the UProperties and 1 specifier for UFunctions. And these are just the basics. There are a lot more, but these will be able to handle, a good chunk of what you want to do, especially early on. Later on in this tutorial series, we'll start to see more advanced specifiers and their uses. So first, I'm going to talk about the first 2, edit anywhere and edit default only. Edit anywhere basically means, and this is the technical definition, it indicates that this property can be edited by property windows in the editor. While the edit default only technical definition indicates that this property can be edited by property windows but only on archetypes. So that's pretty confusing and pretty vague. So I'm going to show us a quick example of what those mean and how they're different. Since last time, I came through and added, several dummy variables. These do nothing. I'm just going to erase them after this tutorial, but they'll kind of show how the specifiers work inside the engine. So if you had followed along last time, we created a very simple player character and we gave him a property of a character name. And with that character name, we used the edit default only specifier. And we gave him the name of Thomas. So if we open up our world map and we drag a couple of these player characters out here, we can just say we got player character 1, 2, and 3. And so if we click on 1 and we want to edit the character, look at he has the name of Thomas. And then if we go on to number 2 and look at him, he also has the name of Thomas. And it's the same. If you go to 3, they all have the name Thomas. And then, so if we then go through here and change this to Peter, for example, hit that, make sure we compile and save. We go back and we select these guys. We open them up and they all now have the name of Peter. And so that's kind of what it means by you can only edit on the archetype. And so the archetype basically means like a pattern. And it's kind of like a template for all player characters. And so this is really useful when there's particular variables that you may want to change across all player characters in the whole game. And it's very easy to then come here and change it in one spot and it changes it for everything. Now, but when we talk about the edit anywhere specifier, we can then come to these player characters that we came and dropped out into the world, and we can click on them and we can scroll down here and see if there's a details panel in the world view. If we can see here that the edit anywhere variable is available here, and we can change his name to A, and then we can click on the second guy, and he doesn't have a name here, but we can change it to B. Click on the third guy, change it to C. And you can see when we switch between them, they all keep that variable we assigned to them. And so that's not to say that you can't use edit default only for things like character name in fear that everyone would be forced to have the same name. That just basically means there are certain variables that maybe use edit default only for maybe health, and the base health of a character is 100, for example. That can then later on be changed in the game individually for each individual character, but as a blanket across all player characters, their base will be 100. And then if later on you decide, that 100 is not enough, you can easily change that to 200 and updates for all characters. While with the edit anywhere variable, maybe just for one particular guy in the world, you want him to start with, maybe 300. Maybe because he's a little bit tougher or he's a boss or something. So that's kind of the difference between those two. It is pretty subtle, but they do definitely have their individual use cases. Next, I want to talk about the visible anywhere and the visible defaults only. And so again, first I'm going to start with their technical definition, and then we can kind of go through and see what those actually mean. So visible anywhere means that indicates that this property is visible in property windows but cannot be edited at all. While visible defaults only indicates that this property is only visible in property windows for archetypes and cannot be edited. So the thing that those two specifiers have in common is they don't allow those variables to be edited. They're just for viewing. So if you're familiar with coding, that means all we can do is get, but we can't set. So if we open up our blueprint again, I came here and made it a dummy variable for this. And so I set here, there's a visible anywhere variable and the visible default only variable. And you can see here in the blueprint for the character that I can't change these. It's grayed out and it's stuck. If we go into the world, and again, we click on these guys and we kind of go down to where the character info is on the detailed panel on the side, we can see that the visible anywhere variable appears here in this view, but the visible default only does not appear in this world view. And so these visible specifiers, they may seem a little peculiar at first, but if you kind of think of the development process of a game, there's kind of three parts. There's three groups of people that we'll want to think about. There's the developers, and then there's the content developers, and then there's the players, so the end user. And so the developer's job is to create the functionality for the content designers or developers to use. So, the developers may create, a teleportation function which can move the player from one place or another. They don't actually put that anywhere in the game, but they just create that functionality. So later, the content developers can come through and say, oh, we're going to place a teleportation pad here that will take the character to the next spot for whatever. And then, they make the game fun for the end user, the player. A second job of the developers is to make sure that the functionality they built is bulletproof. So when the content developers come through, they don't accidentally do something like stupid and break the whole game. So when we think about that process and the visible anywhere variable, you would use these for particular variables that you don't really want to be changed at all by content developers, but they may still want to be aware of. So maybe like off the back of my hand, thinking of an example, maybe you create like a jump, like how high someone can jump in that variable. And so you as a developer set that the jump, he can jump, like 5 feet high. You decided that jump height should not be able to be changed because maybe, like for example, that if they can jump higher than that, the game engine can't handle it and like it breaks. I don't know. That it's a bad example, but just stick with it for a little bit. That way, then when the content developers can come through, they can see that this character can jump 5 feet, but they won't be able to change that. And so if they want that variable to change, they would have to talk to you directly and have you go change it in the code. So these would probably you'd want to be used sparingly, and most likely variables set with the visible only specifier would probably be talked about beforehand, so people would be like aware that that's why these ones won't be able to be changed. If you set like too many of these variables too much, you could be getting calls from like your content developers, like 25 times a day, asking you to tweak certain variables. So they definitely have a use case, but it's more niche than the previous specifiers we talked about. The last couple of specifiers we want to talk about for the U properties are the blueprint read, write, and blueprint read only. And so these seem a little more self-explanatory. With blueprint read, write, it basically means that this property can be read or written from a blueprint, while blueprint read only means that this property can be read by blueprints but not modified. And so with blueprint read, write, in coding sense, that means that this variable has a getter and a setter, while read only means it only has a getter. And so we can kind of see this in play in our code here. So for example, we can see it here. If we come to the graph portion of the character blueprint, we can right click here and it will bring up this list of possible nodes that we may want to use. And then we can do a quick search for the blueprint read write. Okay. So yeah, I made some dummy variables called blueprint read only variable and blueprint read write variable. So you can see here that, oh, didn't want to do that. Want to see the whole list. So you can see here that the blueprint read only variable only has a getter, while the blueprint read write variable has a getter and a setter. So if you remember watching our tutorial last time, we actually went through and wrote our own getters and setters in the code to change the character name. But you could definitely save some time in having to write getters and setters by just giving it that specifier of blueprint read write, and then it'll just do getters and setters for you. And so you can already probably think of off the back of your hand that that's plenty of uses and is very helpful. The last thing I want to talk about is UFunctions. And I'm only going to talk about one specifier for the UFunctions. And this is the most basic, and it's probably what you're going to use the most. But in later on tutorials, I'm going to show a lot more of the capabilities of the UFunctions and their specifiers. And we kind of talked about blueprint callable in our last tutorial series, but I kind of want to go over it a little more in depth in this one. And so to start, I kind of want to talk about what the blueprint system is in general. And so blueprints is Unreal Engine's what they call their visual scripting language. And so if you're familiar with other scripting languages, there's things like Python, Ruby. These are just some examples. Unreal Engine has created their own kind of scripting language, but it's visual. So you don't actually have to know how to write code. You can just drag and drop nodes to create functionality. But just like in Python, if you're familiar with scripting languages, you can write bits of code in C++ and then use Python to call a C++ function. And so it really gives a lot of power to these scripting languages to be able to do things really fast. And if there is something that's computationally more intensive, you can easily just block that out, write it in a more performance conscious language, a language that's faster. and then you can just use the scripting language to call it. And so in our last example, we created getters and setters for the character name, and we gave it the specifier of blueprint callable. So then when we come into the character blueprint and click on the event graph tab, we can then actually call our C++ function, just like in Python. And we can type in get character name, and we can see that the function is right here, and we can call it. And then, we talked about the basics last time, but then you can just drag an arrow, which will then means when this event is triggered, it will then call this function, which will then reference the code and do what we wrote. And so the blueprint callable is probably the most common specifier that you'll be using with UFunctions, but there are plenty others that we will talk about later on when we start to talk about networking games and doing things online with multiplayer. It gets a little more technical. But there is one more aspect I'd like to talk about in this tutorial, and that's the viewport. We've been mostly focusing on the properties aspect of the blueprints, but we can also do a lot of kind of visual things with it as well. And so let's actually close our character and create another example. So if you can kind of think, if you're creating a game and maybe, for example, you want to create kind of like a bar scene. So you're going to have a lot of tables with a lot of chairs and maybe, some like a candle on it. I don't know, some different kind of stuff. You can actually save a lot of time by creating blueprints. And so let me show you a quick example. Let's actually put it over here. Let's come to our blueprints and assets, and let's create a new blueprint class. And this is just going to be an actor, which is the base object for something in the world. And let's call this table set. We can then open up this blueprint, and we can actually add, up here in this top left corner, you can see add component. And we can come down here and we can add a static mesh. And then we can let's call this the table. And then on this right hand side in the details panel, here's everything that, like all the details for a static mesh. And what we can actually do is set this, the mesh as, let's look for a table, small table round. And give it a second to load. And there we go. We got the table. And we're going to want to add some chairs because tables are useless without seating. So we'll add another one and we'll call this chair A. Come over here, search for chair, find a small chair, and add it to the scene. And then we can slide this out a little bit. And then add another chair so you can sit with some friends. Call this chair B. And again, we're going to set this as the chair mesh. You can drag it out here, rotate it, and maybe we put this one like more at an angle just to make it look more authentic. Slide this over here. Maybe rotate it just a tad. Then let's add one more thing just to kind of show you, there's tons of different options that you can do. Let's add another one, and we're just going to call this like a lamp. And this lamp is actually, we're going to set it as a small statue just because we don't actually have a lamp model. We can drag that on top of the table, and then we can scale it down a little bit. And then we can also add a light source to it. So we can scroll down to find our lighting, and this will probably be let's see, do you have any other? No. Yeah, this would probably be like a point light. And we can then, let's see, I want to translate it. Drag this point light up right here. We can even change the intensity so we can like make it not so bright. We put it 1000. Compile and save, then close that. And we can come back to our world, and then we can just grab this table set and just drop it. We can grab more, drop it, drop it, drop it. Then we can, try to make it a little bit more realistic looking. Has some like different rotations of the things. But you can see how by creating a blueprint of this table set, we can then create, we can create a realistic environment a lot more quickly than trying to drop each chair each time for every scene that we'd possibly do. We just make a blueprint of it, drag and drop it. This becomes even more useful when you start to add maybe like functionality to a blueprint. For example, you make like a teleporting pad. It has a volume that has some code associated with it, so when the character steps into the volume, it moves them to a different place. You can make a blueprint of that to just kind of make the teleportation process easier. We don't always have to reset the volume and hook it up with code. Just drag and drop. And it can really save a lot of time when you start to do level design and level creation. And one more quick trick that I kind of just found out about today, I'll kind of show you. If you already have created a scene, you can always go and still break it into blueprints. For example, let me show you. So let's drop a rock over here. Find a small rock and drag and drop it into the level. Here we go. It's taking a second. Drop it. And then with this rock, we're going to add a bush onto it. Just creating some terrain. Then we can also, let's just give it like a friend bush. A little quick shortcut. If you hold Alt and drag it out the object, you duplicate it, so you can save some kind of time. And you can also switch through translation, rotation, and scale by pressing W to translate, E to rotate, and R to scale. And so let's just make maybe this bush smaller and put it right next to this guy. So then we have maybe, a rock and some bushes. Maybe you already added this to your scene. You can actually then go back and select, these three meshes that you have. Come up to this top kind of toolbar section to blueprint and click the little drop down arrow to the right. And then there's the option to convert selected components to blueprint class. And just click that, and let's name it terrain vegetation, and create blueprint. And so now, as you can see, let's just save all of this real quick. So as you can see, if you've already created a scene, it's not a big deal. You can actually save some time by selecting, groups of things that you think look really well, and you can just bust it into a blueprint like this, so you can reuse it, in different areas. And yeah, just like before, I can just drag it. I can then scale the entire blueprint as one whole thing. So maybe make this one huge, and then put it next to this one. Rotate them. So you can see how you can save a lot of time in level design by kind of busting things out into blueprints and just reusing things. So that covers the more visual part of blueprints. And so we kind of went over today, we talked about, properties of blueprints. We talked about, the functions and the visual scripting language. and even the viewport and being able to add meshes and group them together into little clumps. So I hope I was able to just briefly show you the power of blueprints and how they can make your life a lot easier. In our next tutorial, we're going to revisit our code and go back to our character, and we're going to give them some functionality. As you can see over here, they're just ghosts. We're going to add a body to them, give them some movement, and we'll start to really be able to make our game. Thanks for watching, and I hope you guys tune in next time.